I imagine a place beyond the edges of waking thought, a realm where the borders between earth and sky dissolve into something older, something that breathes with the rhythm of countless ages. There is a quality to certain stories that makes them feel less like tales and more like returning, as if the mind already knows these shapes, these names, these faces that peer through the mist of time with eyes both human and infinite. Tonight, the journey leads toward the peaks of mountains that touch the ceiling of the world, toward rivers that have flowed since before memory began to keep its records, toward a tradition so vast and layered that it seems to contain multitudes within multitudes, like nesting dolls carved from starlight and devotion. The gods of the Hindu tradition are not simple. They are not singular. They are oceans of meaning, forests of symbolism, skies filled with stories that overlap and interweave until the boundary between one tale and another becomes as permeable as morning fog. Imagine standing at the edge of a great river at dawn, the Ganges perhaps, or the Yamuna, waters that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, that have carried the prayers of billions, that flow with a patience that makes a human urgency seem like the flutter of a moth's wing. The mist rises from the surface, and in that mist, shapes begin to form, not quite solid, not quite dream. They are presences, with forms that shift according to the needs of those who seek them, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, always vast, beyond the capacity of any single story to contain. This is not a tradition that asks for simplicity. It does not reduce the complexity of existence into neat categories or singular truths. Instead, it sprawls, it proliferates, it embraces paradox with the ease of a river accepting tributaries, each one adding to the whole without diminishing what came before. There are gods here who create and destroy in the same breath, goddesses who nurture and wage war with equal devotion, divine children who play games that determine the fate of worlds, and sages whose thoughts become the architecture of reality itself. To speak of these beings is to enter a landscape where time moves differently, where a single lifetime might span aeons, where a moment of meditation might contain the birth and death of universes, where the playful and the profound dance together without contradiction. The oldest texts speak in a language that feels like it was designed to be chanted, to be sung, to vibrate in the chest and the skull until meaning arrives not through logic alone, but through resonance, through the body's understanding of rhythm and repetition. These are the Vedas, composed in Sanskrit, a tongue so precise that each syllable carries weight, carries power, carries layers of meaning that unfold like lotus petals in slow motion. And from these ancient hymns, these ritual formulas, these cosmic speculations, emerge the figures who will populate a tradition so rich that even after thousands of years, new interpretations continue to blossom like flowers in an endless spring. There is Brahma, the creator, often depicted with four faces looking in all directions, seeing all of time and space simultaneously, holding the Vedas themselves in his hands, embodying the principle of emergence, of manifestation, of the unfolding of potential into form. There is Vishnu, the preserver, who reclines on the cosmic serpent between cycles of creation, who descends into the world in avatar after avatar, taking form as fish, as tortoise, as boar, as half-lion, as dwarf, as warrior prince, as cowherd god, each incarnation a response to a specific crisis, a specific need, a specific imbalance that requires divine intervention. And there is Shiva, the destroyer and transformer, the ascetic meditating on Mount Kailash, the wild dancer whose movements create and dissolve reality, the Lord of contradictions who is both the ultimate renunciate and the devoted husband, both the terrible and the auspicious, holding in his being the necessary truth that destruction and creation are not opposites, but partners in the cosmic dance. These three form what later tradition will call the Trimurti, the triple form, the three aspects of the one divine principle, though even this framework is only one way of understanding, one lens among many through which to glimpse the infinite, because alongside these great gods are their consorts, their feminine counterparts who are not subordinate but essential, not secondary but foundational. Saraswati with her Veena, goddess of learning and music and the flowing of knowledge, Lakshmi with her lotuses, goddess of prosperity and grace and the abundance that nourishes life, Parvati in her many forms, from gentle mountain daughter to fierce warrior goddess, embodying Shakti, the divine feminine power that animates all existence. The landscape of this tradition includes countless other beings. Ganesha with his elephant head, remover of obstacles, lord of beginnings, patron of arts and sciences, Hanuman the monkey god, whose devotion knows no limits, whose strength serves righteousness, whose leap across the ocean becomes a symbol of faith transcending impossible distances. There are the planetary deities, the river goddesses, the sacred mountains personified, the principles of dawn and night given faces and names, the very elements themselves worshipped as divine presences, until the entire cosmos becomes populated with consciousness, with intention, with personality. This is a worldview that sees divinity not as distant or abstract, but as intimately woven into the fabric of existence, present in the stone of the temple and the water of the well, in the cow that gives milk and the tree that offers shade, in the guru who teaches and the parent who nurtures, in the beggar on the street who might be a god in disguise, testing the devotion and generosity of mortals. The stories told about these beings are not simple moral fables. They are complex narratives filled with surprising turns, with ethical ambiguities, with moments of profound beauty and shocking violence, with love that transcends death and jealousy that sparks cosmic wars. And as the mist continues to rise from that river at dawn, as the shapes within it become clearer and then dissolve again into formlessness, the invitation is simply to witness, to allow these stories and these beings to unfold at their own pace, to trust that understanding will come not through forcing or grasping, but through patient attention, through the slow accumulation of images and ideas that will gradually form their own constellation of meaning. The journey has just begun, and there are depths yet to explore. The roots reach back further than almost any other living tradition, back into a time when history and mythology had not yet separated into distinct categories, when the line between what was remembered and what was imagined remained beautifully blurred. In the river valleys of the Indian subcontinent, in a time scholars now place somewhere around 1,500 years before the Common Era, perhaps earlier, perhaps much earlier, groups of people were composing hymns, creating rituals, asking questions about the nature of existence with a sophistication that still startles those who encounter these texts for the first time. These were the Vedic people, and their world was one of fire altars and soma offerings, of priests who memorized thousands of verses with such precision that the oral tradition preserved exact syllables across countless generations, creating a living library carried in human memory. The oldest layer, the Rig Veda, contains 10 mandalas, 10 circles of hymns, and within these circles are prayers addressed to forces of nature that are already being personified, already being understood as conscious beings with preferences and personalities. There is Agni, the fire god, present in every hearth and every ritual flame, the messenger between human and divine realms, the witness to every sacrifice, the mouth of the gods that consumes offerings and transforms them into sacred smoke, rising toward heaven. There is Indra, the storm god, the warrior deity who drinks soma and grows mighty, who wields the thunderbolt, who battles the serpent demon Vritra to release the waters, to bring rain, to make the world fertile and habitable. His exploits recounted in hymn after hymn with a vigor and celebration that makes the ancient poetry pulse with energy. There is Varuna, keeper of cosmic order, guardian of Rita, the principle of natural law and moral truth, he who knows all secrets, who sees through darkness, whose 1,000 eyes observe every action, every thought, every deviation from the path of righteousness. And there is Surya, the sun, and Ushas, the dawn, and Vayu, the wind, and the Ashvins, the divine horsemen who race across the sky, each deity embodying some aspect of the natural world while also transcending it, possessing stories and relationships that make them more than mere personifications. But even in these earliest texts, there are hints of something more, questions that probe beneath the surface of polytheistic worship, hymns that ask where these gods came from, whether they too had an origin, whether there might be something prior even to them. The Nasadya Sukta, the hymn of creation, poses questions rather than providing answers. It describes a time before being and non-being existed, before death or immortality, before day or night, a primordial state of potential from which everything emerged. And it ends by wondering whether even the highest gods know the secret of creation, or whether that knowledge belongs to something beyond naming. This philosophical questioning would only deepen over time. But in the Vedic period, the focus remained largely on ritual, on the proper performance of sacrifices, on maintaining the relationship between human and divine through offerings, through praise, through the careful pronunciation of sacred syllables. The priests who performed these rituals were the Brahmins, a class of specialists who devoted their lives to mastering the complex procedures, the exact intonations, the precise gestures required to make the sacrifices efficacious. They were the keepers of sacred knowledge, the intermediaries between worlds. And the rituals themselves could be elaborate affairs, lasting for days, sometimes for years, involving multiple priests, hundreds of verses, offerings of grain and ghee and animals, the construction of temporary fire, altars with geometrically precise dimensions, the whole enterprise designed to maintain cosmic order, to ensure the prosperity of kings, to secure blessings for the community. Within this ritual framework, the gods were present as honored guests, as powerful allies, as beings who could be pleased or offended, who had their favorite offerings and their preferred modes of address, who might grant sons or wealth or victory in battle if properly propitiated. But the Vedic corpus is vast, and it evolved over centuries, and gradually the focus began to shift from external ritual to internal understanding, from the mechanics of sacrifice to the meaning behind the symbols. The later portions of the Vedas, the Brahmanas, contained detailed explanations of ritual procedures, but they also included stories, mythological narratives that explained why certain practices existed, that connected ritual actions to cosmic events, that made the sacrifice itself a reenactment of creation. And then came the Aranyakas, the forest texts, composed by those who had withdrawn from village life, who meditated in wilderness places, who sought understanding through contemplation rather than through elaborate ceremony, and finally, the Upanishads, perhaps the most revolutionary texts in the entire tradition, dialogues between teachers and students, between sages and kings, between seekers and those who had found, conversations that turned the attention inward, that asked not about the gods out there, but about the divine principle within. The Upanishads introduced concepts that would transform the entire tradition, the idea of Brahman, the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, infinite, eternal, beyond all qualities, yet the source of all qualities, not a god among gods, but the reality that underlies gods and humans and all of existence, and the idea of Atman, the inner self, the consciousness that witnesses all experience, that persists through all changes, that is, in the most radical formulation, identical with Brahman, the famous equation tattvam asi, that thou art, collapsing the distinction between the individual soul and the cosmic absolute. These were not ideas that replaced the gods, rather they recontextualized them. The deities of the Vedic pantheon remained important, remained objects of worship and devotion, but they were now understood as manifestations, as particular expressions of the one ultimate reality, as faces that the formless shows to those who need form. This philosophical development occurred gradually, over centuries, in different regions with different emphases. There was no single moment of revelation, no founder declaring a new doctrine. Instead, there was an organic evolution, a slow maturation of ideas through countless conversations, countless meditations, countless moments of insight accumulated and refined. And during this same long period, the society itself was developing the structures that would characterize it for millennia. The Varna system, the division into Brahmins, who performed rituals, Kshatriyas, who governed and fought, Vaishyas, who engaged in commerce and agriculture, and Shudras, who provided service, each group with its own duties, its own dharma, its own role in maintaining the cosmic and social order. The concept of dharma itself became central, this word that means law, duty, righteousness, cosmic order, the way things should be. It was dharma that held everything together, that gave each being its proper place, its proper function, and the gods were understood as guardians and exemplars of dharma, as beings whose actions demonstrated what it meant to live in accordance with cosmic law. But dharma was not simple, not uniform. It varied according to one's station in life, one's age, one's circumstances. What was dharma for a warrior might be adharma for a priest. What was appropriate in youth might be forbidden in old age. The tradition embraced this complexity, this contextual ethics that refused to reduce moral life to simple commandments. Alongside dharma came the ideas of karma and samsara, the understanding that actions have consequences that extend beyond a single lifetime, that the soul transmigrates from body to body, experiencing the fruits of past deeds, creating through each action the conditions for future existence. This was not originally a Vedic concept. It appeared in the Upanishads without clear precedent, and it fundamentally altered the religious landscape, because now the question was not just how to please the gods or perform correct rituals, but how to escape the cycle altogether, how to achieve moksha, liberation, release from the wheel of birth and death. Different paths emerged, different methods proposed for achieving this liberation. The path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, through direct realization of one's identity with Brahman. The path of meditation and withdrawal, leading to the development of what would become yoga in its classical forms. And the path of action, Karma Yoga, performing one's duty without attachment to results. And woven through all of this, the gods continued to evolve, to accumulate new attributes, new stories, new forms of worship. Indra, the great warrior of the Vedas, began to fade somewhat in importance, while other deities grew in stature and complexity. Rudra, a fierce deity mentioned in the Vedas, associated with storms and healing, with the wilderness and the terrifying aspects of nature, gradually transformed into Shiva, acquiring attributes and myths that made him one of the great gods of the tradition. No longer just a dangerous force to be appeased, but a complex figure embodying contradiction, the ascetic and the householder, the destroyer and the transformer, the lord of yoga and the cosmic dancer. And Vishnu, who in the Vedas was a relatively minor solar deity, known mainly for taking 3 steps to measure the universe, began to grow in significance, to accumulate a mythology of preservation and intervention, of descending into the world to restore balance whenever Dharma declined. The idea of the avatar, the descent, the divine incarnation, became particularly associated with Vishnu, and stories began to be told of his various forms. The fish who saved Manu from the flood, the tortoise who supported the mountain used to churn the cosmic ocean, the boar who rescued the earth from the depths, each myth addressing some crisis, some threat to the cosmic order that required divine response. These were not yet the fully developed narratives that would appear in later texts, but the seeds were being planted. The mythological imagination was at work, connecting different stories, harmonizing different traditions, creating ever more elaborate frameworks for understanding the divine. And the goddess, who had been present in the Vedas in various forms, as Usha's the dawn, as Vak the sacred speech, as Prithvi the earth, began to be understood in more unified ways, as Shakti, as Devi, as the divine feminine principle that was not subordinate to the masculine but essential, the power without which even the greatest gods could not act. This was a slow emergence happening across different regions with different emphases. In some areas, the goddess traditions remained local and distinct. In others, they began to coalesce into pan-Indian forms, but the recognition of divine feminine power as fundamental to the cosmos was growing, deepening, preparing the ground for later developments. The period between the composition of the early Upanishads and the beginning of the Common Era was one of remarkable ferment. Buddhism and Jainism emerged during this time, offering alternative paths, challenging certain Vedic assumptions while accepting others, and the tradition that would come to be called Hinduism responded with its own creativity, its own evolution. The gods were not static figures. They were living presences in the imagination and devotion of countless people, and they grew, changed, absorbed influences, merged with local deities, took on regional characteristics, became simultaneously more universal and more particular, more philosophical and more accessible, more abstract and more personal. By the time the Common Era began, the foundations were in place for the great flooring that would come. The epics were being composed. The Puranas were beginning to take shape. New forms of devotion were emerging, and the gods of the Hindu tradition were ready to enter their classical period, their time of fullest elaboration and most magnificent storytelling. But that development belonged to the future. For now, in this early period, the essential patterns had been established, the questions had been asked, the paths had been marked, and the divine beings who would walk those paths with humanity for thousands of years to come had begun to reveal their natures, their stories, their inexhaustible capacity to meet human longing with forms both terrible and beautiful, both familiar and utterly beyond comprehension. The great turning came with the epics, those massive narrative oceans that would shape the religious imagination of the subcontinent for millennia, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Texts so vast and so embedded in cultural consciousness that they ceased to be merely stories and became something more like shared dreams, collective memories of a time when gods walked among mortals and every action carried cosmic weight. The Mahabharata, attributed to the sage Vyasa, grew over centuries through oral transmission and gradual accretion until it reached a length of some 100,000 verses, making it perhaps the longest poem ever composed, a work so encyclopedic that it contains within itself philosophies and myths and genealogies and legal discussions and romantic interludes and battlefield descriptions of stunning brutality. At its heart lies a family conflict, a war between cousins, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, fighting for control of a kingdom. But this human drama unfolds against a backdrop of divine intervention, because the Pandavas are themselves semi-divine, born through blessings to mothers whose husbands could not produce heirs, Yudhishthira, son of Dharma itself, Bhima, son of the wind god, Arjuna, son of Indra, and the twins Nakula and Sahadeva, sons of the celestial horsemen. And most crucially, their companion and charioteer is Krishna, who appears first as a prince, a cowherd, a political advisor, a friend, but who reveals himself at the pivotal moment before battle as something infinitely greater, as Vishnu incarnate, as the Supreme Lord who contains all the gods within himself, all the worlds, all of time past and future. This revelation comes in the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Lord, that section of the epic that has become perhaps the most beloved and most commented upon text in the entire tradition. 700 verses of dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna on the battlefield, on the cusp of a war that will destroy most of the warriors assembled there. Arjuna falters, seeing his teachers and relatives and friends arrayed on both sides, recognizing that victory will require killing those he loves, and he lays down his weapons, refuses to fight, asks how such slaughter could ever be justified. And Krishna responds not with simple reassurance, but with teachings that unfold layer by layer, first addressing Arjuna's immediate concern, explaining that the soul is eternal, that bodies are merely garments changed from life to life, that the wise grieve neither for the living nor the dead because they understand the imperishable nature of the self. But the discourse deepens, expands. Krishna describes the path of selfless action, performing one's duty without attachment to results, acting in the world while remaining internally free. This is karma yoga, the way of engagement without bondage, of participation without entanglement. And then he speaks of devotion, of bhakti, of the path of loving surrender to the divine, describing how even those who cannot master meditation or renunciation can reach the highest goal through simple, heartfelt worship, through offering flowers or water or even a leaf with sincere devotion, because what matters is not the grandeur of the offering, but the love with which it is given. And finally, when Arjuna asks to see Krishna's true form, the text describes a theophany, a vision of the cosmic form, the Vishvarupa, in which Arjuna perceives all of existence within Krishna's body, sees past and present and future simultaneously, sees gods and demons and humans being swallowed by time's inexorable flow, sees the entire universe as Krishna's play, his Leela, his dance of creation and dissolution. The description is overwhelming, terrifying, and beautiful at once. Arjuna sees Krishna as the source of all, as time itself devouring the worlds, as the beginning and middle and end of all beings, and he trembles, asks to see again the familiar gentle form of his friend, because the cosmic vision is more than human consciousness can bear for long. This text, this dialogue, introduced ideas that would reshape devotional practice throughout the tradition, the notion that God could be approached as friend, as beloved, as intimate companion rather than merely as distant transcendent reality. The idea that grace mattered more than ritual precision, that sincerity counted more than birth or learning. Krishna himself became the focus of intense devotional movements. His childhood stories elaborated in the Puranas, tales of the divine infant stealing butter, lifting mountains to protect cowherds from storms, dancing on the heads of serpents, playing his flute in the forests of Vrindavan, while the gopis, the cowherd women, abandoned their duties to dance with him in the moonlight. These stories of Krishna's youthful exploits, his Ras Leela, his circular dance of divine love, became potent symbols of the soul's longing for union with the divine. The gopis elicit love for Krishna read as metaphor for the way spiritual seekers must abandon worldly attachments, must risk everything, must transgress ordinary dharma itself in pursuit of the highest truth. And alongside Krishna, the other avatar stories multiplied. Vishnu's descent as Ramas in the Ramayana, that other great epic, the tale of the prince exiled from his kingdom through palace intrigue, wandering the forests with his wife Sita and brother Lakshmana, facing the demon king Ravana who abducts Sita, building an army of monkeys and bears to cross the ocean to Lanka and rescue her. The Ramayana, attributed to the poet Valmiki, presents Rama as the ideal king, the perfect son, the devoted husband, Dharma embodied in human form, his story unfolding with a tragic grandeur, because even divine incarnations must suffer in the world of samsara, must face impossible choices and endure separation and loss. Sita herself becomes a model of virtue. Though later interpreters would struggle with aspects of her story, her trial by fire to prove her purity after rescue, her eventual abandonment by Rama due to public gossip, the text itself seems to recognize these tensions. these moments where Dharma demands cruelty, where righteousness requires sacrifice that feels unjust. But Rama's story also includes moments of profound devotion, particularly in the figure of Hanuman, the monkey god who serves Rama with absolute loyalty, who leaps across the ocean in a single bound, who carries mountains with healing herbs, who tears open his chest to show Rama and Sita enthroned in his heart. Hanuman became the exemplar of bhakti, of devotion so complete that it transcends all obstacles, so powerful that it grants superhuman strength and courage. These epics circulated through performance, through recitation, through traveling bards who would spend weeks or months telling the stories in villages across the subcontinent, and the gods within them became familiar presences, known intimately through repeated encounter, their personalities and preferences and stories woven into the fabric of daily life. And then came the Puranas, 18 major texts and numerous minor ones, encyclopedias of mythology and cosmology and genealogy, each Purana associated with one of the great gods: the Vishnu Purana, the Shiva Purana, the Devi Bhagavata Purana, texts that elaborated the myths hinted at in earlier sources, that created vast narrative universes around each deity. The Puranas describe the cycles of creation and dissolution, the kalpas and yugas, vast time periods that make human history seem like the blink of an eye. They describe how Brahma creates the universe from a lotus growing from Vishnu's navel, how that universe exists for billions of years before dissolving back into the cosmic ocean, how this cycle repeats endlessly, creation and destruction as the breath of the divine. They tell the story of the churning of the milk ocean, how gods and demons work together to extract the nectar of immortality, how Vishnu took the form of a beautiful woman to distract the demons while the gods drank the Amrita, how various treasures emerged from the churning, including Lakshmi herself, rising from the waters on a lotus, choosing Vishnu as her consort. They elaborate Shiva's mythology, his marriage to Sati, who immolates herself when her father insults her husband, Shiva's grief so intense that he carries her corpse across the world in a dance of mourning, her body parts falling to earth and becoming sacred sites, and then her rebirth as Parvati, the daughter of the mountains, who wins Shiva through devoted practice, through tapas, the ascetic heat that generates spiritual power. The Puranas describe Shiva's cosmic dance, the Tandava, performed in the hall with 1,000 pillars, his dance that creates and destroys the universe, his drum mark in time, his hand raised in the gesture of fearlessness, his foot crushing the demon of ignorance, the circle of flames surrounding him representing the cycle of birth and death, this image becoming one of the most iconic in the entire tradition. They tell of Ganesha's birth, created by Parvati from the dirt of her own body, set to guard her door while she bathed, beheaded by Shiva, who did not recognize him, and then restored to life with an elephant's head, becoming the remover of obstacles, the lord of beginnings, the patron of writers and merchants, and anyone embarking on new endeavors. They describe the goddess in her many forms as Durga, riding a lion, created from the combined energies of all the gods to defeat the buffalo demon Mahishasura, who could not be killed by any male being, as Kali dancing on battlefields, wearing a garland of skulls, her tongue extended, fierce and terrible, yet also the loving mother who protects her devotees, as Saraswati in white garments, holding the Veena, seated on a lotus or a swan, embodying the flow of knowledge and artistic inspiration. These texts also systematize the practice of puja, the ritual worship that became central to Hindu devotional life, describing how to establish images in temples, how to invoke the deity's presence, how to offer flowers and incense and food, how to perform circumambulation, how to receive prasad, the blessed food that has been offered to and accepted by the god. The temple itself became understood as a cosmic diagram, a three-dimensional mandala, its architecture encoding philosophical and cosmological principles. The central shrine representing the cave of the heart, where the divine dwells, the towering superstructure symbolizing the sacred mountain, the circumambulatory path allowing devotees to honor the deity by walking around the sacred space. And different regions developed their own styles. The Nagara temples of the north with their curving towers, the Dravida temples of the south with their gopurams, gateway towers covered in sculpted figures, rising tier upon tier, entire cities built around temple complexes that became centers of learning and art and economic life. The gods enshrined in these temples were treated as royal persons, awakened in the morning, bathed and dressed, offered meals throughout the day, entertained with music and dance, put to bed at night. The ritualists, understanding that the infinite formless Brahman had graciously consented to dwell in the image, had accepted limitation out of compassion, making the divine accessible to those who needed form and presence. And alongside the grand temples, countless small shrines, roadside stones smeared with vermilion, trees wrapped in sacred thread, every village with its local manifestations of the great gods, its Gramadevata, its protective spirits and ancestors who might be fierce or benign, who required propitiation and respect, who mediated between the cosmic deities and everyday concerns. The philosophical schools also flourished during these centuries. Vedanta, in various forms, interpreting the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutras and the Gita in different ways. Shankara, teaching absolute non-dualism, that only Brahman is real and the world is Maya, appearance, superimposition like the snake mistaken for a rope in dim light. Ramanuja, teaching a qualified non-dualism, that souls and the world are real but dependent on Brahman, like waves are real manifestations of the ocean, not separate, but also not merely illusory. His philosophy supporting devotional practice by affirming the reality of the personal God worthy of love and worship. Madhva teaching dualism, eternal distinction between God and souls, between the Creator and creation, 5 fundamental differences that are never overcome even in liberation. His vision preserving the devotional relationship while granting souls their own intrinsic reality, and the tantric traditions emerging, working with the body as a site of transformation, with kundalini energy rising through the chakras, with mantras and yantras and complex ritual practices, understanding the goddess as Shakti, the dynamic power that activates Shiva's static consciousness, the two eternally joined in the generative tension that produces all manifestation. These centuries saw an explosion of devotional poetry in regional languages, Tamil, Bengali, Marathi, Hindi, the saints singing of their love for Krishna or Rama or Shiva, Mirabai abandoning her royal status to wander as a devotee, Tulsidas retelling the Ramayana in a vernacular that made it accessible to those without Sanskrit, Kabir weaving together Hindu and Muslim imagery in verses that challenged orthodoxy and sectarian division. The gods became companions in this devotional outpouring, Krishna addressed as friend, as child, as lover, Rama revered as the perfect Lord worthy of service. Shiva approached through ecstatic identification, the devotees often describing states of possession, of merger, of love so intense it dissolved the boundaries of self. And as centuries passed into centuries, as empires rose and fell across the subcontinent, as languages evolved and arts flourished, and philosophies debated in temple courtyards and forest hermitages, the gods continued their own evolution, responding to new contexts, new questions, new longings in the hearts of those who called upon them. The medieval period brought waves of political change, sultanates, and then the Mughal Empire establishing Islamic rule over much of the subcontinent, and the Hindu tradition responded not with uniformity, but with its characteristic multiplicity, some communities maintaining practices unchanged, others adapting, still others creating new syntheses that drew from multiple sources. The Bhakti movement intensified during these centuries, spreading across regions, crossing caste boundaries, challenging Brahminical authority through the radical claim that devotion mattered more than birth or learning, that a low-caste leather worker or a woman poet could achieve union with the divine through love alone, without elaborate rituals or scholarly knowledge of Sanskrit texts. The saints of this movement came from every stratum of society. Namdev the tailor, Kabir the weaver, Ravidas the cobbler, their songs declaring that the divine dwelt not in temples alone, but in the heart of every sincere seeker, that external observances meant nothing without internal transformation, that the same truth could be called Krishna or Allah, Rama or Rahim, names pointing toward a reality beyond all naming. Chaitanya in Bengal danced through the streets in ecstatic devotion to Krishna, creating a movement that emphasized congregational singing, kirtan, the collective raising of voices in praise. His followers developing sophisticated theologies around the relationship between Krishna and the devotee, mapping the stages of love from initial attraction through deepening intimacy toward the ultimate union that preserves distinction even in merger. The Alvars and Nayanars in the Tamil South had pioneered this devotional intensity centuries earlier, singing in the vernacular, visiting temple after temple, their songs collected into sacred canons, the Nalayira Divya Prabandham for the Vaishnavas, the Tevaram for the Shaivas, texts that rivaled the Vedas in devotional authority, that demonstrated the power of love expressed in human languages rather than Sanskrit alone, and the goddess traditions flourished with particular intensity. The Devi Mahatmya, recounting how Durga slew Mahishasura, how Kali emerged from Durga's forehead to destroy demons, how the goddess in her various forms protected the cosmos when the gods themselves proved insufficient. These narratives affirming feminine divine power as supreme, as the source from which even the great male gods derived their efficacy. The Shakta Tantras describe the goddess as the ultimate reality, Shiva without Shakti reduced to a corpse, powerless, inert. Only through union with the feminine principle could consciousness actualize its creative potential. This theological vision supporting goddess worship as the highest path, Devi not as consort, but as the supreme deity herself. Regional forms of the goddess proliferated. Kali worshipped in Bengal with intense devotion, Ramakrishna in the 19th century spending hours in her temple, falling into trances, experiencing visions, teaching that all religions led to the same truth, but choosing to approach that truth through the form of the Divine Mother, his disciple Vivekananda, carrying this message to the West, introducing Hindu philosophy to audiences who had known nothing of it. The colonial period brought new challenges and transformations. British rule, imposing foreign categories on Hindu traditions, administrators attempting to codify laws, to systematize practices, to understand through their own frameworks a tradition that had always resisted singular definition. Hindu intellectuals responded variously, some internalizing colonial critiques, attempting to reform practices seen as backward, opposing child marriage, promoting widow remarriage, questioning caste discrimination, often drawing on ancient texts to argue that contemporary practices had deviated from original purity. Others asserted continuity and value, defending practices as expressions of profound philosophical truths misunderstood by outsiders, arguing that the tradition's diversity and tolerance exceeded anything found in Christianity or Islam. That idol worship reflected sophisticated understanding of the formless manifesting through form. The gods themselves became contested symbols, reformers sometimes arguing for a more abstract monotheism, suggesting that worship of multiple deities represented primitive superstition that educated Hindus should transcend, while traditionalists insisted on the validity of polytheistic practice, on the reality of the gods as distinct personalities worthy of devotion. Gandhi drew on the tradition selectively, using the concept of ahimsa, nonviolence, as a political weapon against colonial rule, reading the Gita as a text about spiritual struggle rather than literal warfare. His interpretation innovative, yet presented as recovery of authentic meaning, the text's flexibility allowing for this creative reappropriation. He also elevated the figure of Rama, using the name Ram Rajya, Rama's kingdom, to describe the ideal society he hoped independent India would become, though his vision emphasized justice and equality in ways that went beyond traditional interpretations. Rama reimagined as symbol of righteous governance rather than simply royal authority. Independence brought new questions about the relationship between religious tradition and modern nation-state, the secular constitution protecting religious freedom, while many continued to see Indian identity as fundamentally Hindu, the gods invoked in political rhetoric, temples becoming sites where national and religious identities merged and sometimes clashed. The 20th century also saw Hindu traditions spreading beyond the subcontinent through migration and missionary activity, yoga traveling to the West, first in rarefied forms taught by swamis to small groups of seekers, then gradually popularized, adapted, separated from its religious context, and repackaged as wellness practice, as fitness routine, as stress management technique. Meditation practices followed similar trajectories. Transcendental meditation offering mantras stripped of their devotional meanings. Mindfulness drawing on Buddhist sources but finding ready adoption among those familiar with Hindu contemplative traditions. The boundaries between traditions blurring in diaspora contexts. The gods themselves acquired new forms and contexts. Krishna and Ganesha appearing on posters in college dorm rooms, their images aestheticized, commodified, divorced from ritual practice, yet still somehow carrying resonance, still pointing towards something seekers found meaningful even when translated into utterly foreign settings. ISKCON, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, established temples around the world, introducing Westerners to ecstatic devotion, to kirtan and prasad, and the philosophy of Chaitanya's lineage, their translation of the Bhagavad Gita spreading widely, becoming for many their first encounter with Hindu texts. Though traditionalists sometimes question the movement's innovations and evangelistic approach, Hindu communities in diaspora built temples that became cultural centers, places where immigrant families could maintain connections to tradition, where children could learn languages and stories and practices their parents feared might otherwise be lost. The gods presiding over community gatherings that were simultaneously religious and social, devotional and ethnic, and back in India, the tradition continued its internal debates and developments, new gurus arising, some controversial, some revered, all claiming to offer authentic paths, while often innovating freely, combining traditional elements in novel ways, using modern media to spread their messages, attracting followers who might seek spiritual guidance while remaining skeptical of institutional religion. The gods appeared in new media, in calendar art, in comic books, in television serials that became cultural phenomena, entire communities gathering to watch episodes of the Ramayana or Mahabharata, the gods' stories told through these modern forms, reaching audiences far larger than any temple ritual or scripture recitation could access. Films explored mythological themes, sometimes reverently, sometimes playfully, sometimes controversially. The gods, as characters in narratives that might affirm tradition or question it, that might present them as literal beings or as psychological symbols. The interpretive possibilities as multiple as the tradition itself, and philosophical explorations continued, scholars and practitioners debating the meaning of ancient texts, producing new commentaries on the Upanishads and Gita, arguing about whether Vedanta pointed toward non-dualism or theism or something that escaped these categories altogether, the tradition's intellectual vitality undiminished by modernity's challenges. The environmental movement found resources in Hindu traditions, ideas of the earth as goddess, of rivers as sacred, of trees as worthy of reverence. These concepts deployed in conservation efforts, used to argue for environmental protection on religious grounds, though critics noted the gap between ideals and practices, between reverence for nature in principle and its exploitation in fact. Feminist scholars grappled with the tradition's complex legacy, finding empowerment in goddess worship, yet also critiquing patriarchal structures, celebrating Sita and Draupadi, yet questioning the constraints imposed on women in their names, recovering forgotten female saints and philosophers, while challenging interpretations that subordinated women, the goddesses themselves becoming sites of contested meaning. And through all these transformations, through colonialism and independence, through diaspora and globalization, through modernization and its discontents, the gods remained, not unchanged, never unchanged, but continuous, recognizable, their stories still told, their names still invoked, their images still venerated in temples, ancient and newly built, in homes and roadside shrines, in the inner sanctums of hearts, still seeking meaning through forms inherited from countless generations. The tradition that had begun with Vedic hymns beside ritual fires had become something vast and varied beyond any simple description, encompassing philosophy and devotion, ritual and meditation, social structures and personal quests. inclusive of countless local variations and sectarian distinctions, yet somehow also unified by shared stories and symbols and practices. To speak of the gods of Hinduism in the singular was to falsify through oversimplification, yet to catalog every regional form and theological interpretation would be to drown in detail without grasping the patterns, the family resemblances, the themes that recurred across contexts. These were gods who created and destroyed, who descended and withdrew, who demanded sacrifice, yet also granted grace freely, who embodied contradictions without being contradictory, who were one and many simultaneously, who were ultimate reality and also personalities with preferences and moods, who transcended all form yet welcomed worship through images, who had existed forever yet also manifested in historical time. And perhaps this multiplicity, this refusal of singular definition, this comfort with paradox and plurality, was itself the deepest truth the tradition offered. Not a bug, but a feature, not confusion, but sophistication, a recognition that the infinite could not be captured in any single formulation, that the divine necessarily appeared differently to different seekers in different circumstances. That truth itself was too large for uniformity. The gods had journeyed far from those Vedic fire altars, yet they remained connected to them. The hymns still chanted, the rituals still performed, the questions still asked. Continuity and change braided together like the Ganges and Yamuna at their confluence, distinct yet flowing together toward an ocean that contained them both. The deepening quiet of contemplation draws the mind toward patterns, toward the shapes that emerge when stepping back from individual stories, from particular deities, toward the underlying currents that flow through thousands of years of devotion and speculation. There is a quality to these gods that resists the categories often applied to them. To call them merely metaphors feels reductive, as if those who prostrated before their images or sang their names were engaged in some elaborate misunderstanding. Yet to insist on their literal objective existence in the way a mountain exists also misses something essential, some flexibility, some creative interplay between the divine and the devotee that makes the relationship more dynamic than simple realism allows. The tradition itself seems comfortable with this ambiguity, with affirming that the gods are real, while also explaining them as aspects of Brahman, as Maya, as Lala, as play and illusion and manifestation all at once, the philosophical and the devotional held together without requiring resolution into singular truth. Consider the concept of Ista Devata, the chosen deity, the recognition that different practitioners might focus devotion on different gods, not because one is true and others false, but because different personalities resonate with different aspects of the infinite. Some drawn to Shiva's asceticism, others to Krishna's playfulness, still others to the fierce protection of Kali, each valid, each offering a genuine path, the diversity celebrated rather than suppressed. Or consider the narratives themselves, the way stories contradict without anxiety. Ganesha's birth told differently in different texts. The goddess described as Shiva's wife in some contexts and as the supreme power from which he emerges in others, the chronology impossible to reconcile if treated as history, yet perfectly coherent as mythology, as truth expressed through story rather than through chronicle. The gods teach through their contradictions. Shiva, the ascetic, who is also the householder, the destroyer who preserves through destroying, the master of yoga who dances in ecstatic abandon. These are not flaws in the characterization, but invitations to deeper understanding, to recognizing that ultimate reality cannot be confined to comfortable categories, that the divine necessarily exceeds human logic, and the avatars of Vishnu encode a cosmological vision, the progression from fish to tortoise to boar, to man-lion to dwarf to warrior, sometimes read as evolutionary sequence, sometimes as myth cycle, always as demonstration that the divine takes whatever form is needed, that there is no situation so desperate, no crisis so severe that intervention cannot come, even if it comes in unexpected guise. The goddess traditions perhaps probe most deeply into paradox. Kali dancing on Shiva's corpse, yet also the nurturing mother. Durga created by the gods, yet superior to them. Saraswati's gentle wisdom and Kali's fierce destruction understood as aspects of single feminine principle. The tradition refusing to separate the creative and destructive, the beautiful and terrible, insisting they are inseparable, that life feeds on death, that creation requires destruction, that the mother who gives life also takes it away. There is also the question of darshan, the seeing and being seen by the deity. This practice that makes temple worship not about asking favors or performing obligations, but about encountering presence, about standing before the image and allowing oneself to be beheld, to be known, the eyes of the god, meeting the eyes of the devotee in an exchange that is somehow mutual, despite the vast disparity in being and the festivals that punctuate the year. Diwali's lights welcoming Lakshmi, Navaratri's 9 nights honoring the goddess, Holi's colors celebrating Krishna's play, Mahashivaratri's vigil of fasting and meditation, these rhythms connecting communities, marking time not just chronologically, but mythologically, allowing participants to enter sacred time, to reenact cosmic events, to align their lives with divine patterns. The practice of mantra carries its own depths. The repetition of names, of syllables, of entire hymns, the sound itself considered powerful, transformative, the vibration altering consciousness, not through meaning alone, but through resonance, through the physical experience of speaking or hearing sacred speech. Om Namah Shivaya, Hare Krishna, Om Aim Sarasvatyai Namah. Each formula a key opening particular doors, invoking particular presences, and the sacred geography that maps the divine onto landscape, the 7 sacred cities, the 12 Jyotir Lingas, the 51 Shakti Pithas, pilgrimage routes connecting these sites, millions walking for days or weeks to bathe in rivers made holy by mythological events, to climb mountains where gods meditated, to circumambulate temples that mark where the divine touched earth, the land itself sacralized through story, every rock and river potentially the site of ancient events, of ongoing presence. The arts too become vehicles for the divine. Classical dance depicting stories of Krishna and Shiva, each gesture codified, each movement laden with meaning, the dancer not performing about the gods, but embodying them, becoming for the duration of the dance a living icon, music as devotion, ragas as offerings, the boundaries between aesthetic experience and religious practice dissolving, and always the texts, the endless production of commentaries and poems and philosophical treatises, each generation adding to the conversation, interpreting, reinterpreting, finding new meanings in ancient words, the tradition alive because it continues to generate thought, to provoke questions, to demand engagement rather than passive acceptance. Perhaps what distinguishes this pantheon is its refusal of finality, its comfort with ongoing elaboration, with regional variations and sectarian developments that splinter and recombine without destroying underlying unity, the way Hinduism encompasses rather than excludes, how it absorbs local deities into larger frameworks, how it allows for both monotheism and polytheism, both personal God and impersonal absolute, both this worldly engagement and renunciation, the capacity to hold contradictions not as problems to solve, but as truths to honor. The gods remain inexhaustible. After thousands of years, after countless stories and songs and philosophical analyses, they still generate new meanings, still speak to contemporary concerns, still offer forms through which the formless can be approached, still invite the devotion and contemplation and creative engagement that keeps tradition living rather than merely preserved. And so the journey through these divine presences begins to curve back toward stillness, toward the quiet from which it emerged, the stories told, the patterns observed, the questions raised and left hanging in the air like incense, smoke drifting upward. The gods of the Hindu tradition are not artifacts, not relics of a superseded worldview. They are living realities for hundreds of millions, presences invoked daily in temples and homes, in moments of crisis and moments of celebration, their names on the lips of the dying and the newborn, woven so deeply into culture and consciousness that to extract them would be to unravel the entire fabric. Yet they are also more than communal heritage, more than ethnic tradition. They are explorations of the possible relationships between human and divine, between finite and infinite, between the urgency of embodied life and the peace of transcendence. Each god a different question, a different answer, a different path up the mountain that all paths climb. To have spent this time in their presence, to have followed their evolution from Vedic hymns, through epic narratives, through devotional movements, through modern reinterpretations, is to have traced one of humanity's longest continuous conversations, one of our most sustained attempts to give form to the formless, to make the infinite intimate, to bridge the chasm between the mortal and the eternal. The images remain: Vishnu on his serpent, Shiva in meditation, Ganesha with his broken tusk, Durga on her lion, Krishna with his flute, each one a doorway, an invitation, a promise that the divine can be known, not fully, never fully, but genuinely, that grace flows toward those who seek, that presence answers the call of longing. And perhaps in the end, what these gods offer is not solutions, but companionship, not answers, but deepening questions, not escape from the human condition, but sacred interpretation of it. They suffer and love and create and destroy alongside those who worship them. They are both utterly other and strangely familiar, both far beyond and somehow near. The temple bells ring at dusk. The arati flames circle before the images. Voices rise in ancient Sanskrit and contemporary vernaculars. And for a moment, the boundaries thin between past and present, between myth and history, between the world as it is and the world as it might be if the divine truly dwelt within it. The Ganges continues its flow. The mountains stand in their eternal patience. The stories are told again to children who will tell them to their children. And the gods remain, shifting, evolving, responding to new devotions and new doubts, as inexhaustible as the human capacity for wonder, as enduring as the questions that wake us in the darkness and follow us into light. The narratives could continue forever. Each god has 1,000 names, each name a story, each story branching into others, the traditions structured like a fractal, the same patterns repeating at every scale, infinity contained in finite forms, the many and the one engaged in eternal conversation. But there is also value in silence, in allowing the words to slow, to space themselves further apart, to recognize that some truths live in the pauses between statements, in the resonance that lingers after the bell has been struck, in the darkness beyond the circle of firelight, where something immense and ancient breathes with patience that makes human time seem like the flutter of leaves. The gods have been generous, sharing their stories, allowing themselves to be discussed and analyzed and contemplated, but they are not exhausted by this attention. They remain, always more to discover, always depths unplumbed, always new aspects to reveal to those who seek with sincerity and devotion. And so the story finds its end, though not conclusion, because these gods have no conclusion. They continue in temples and hearts, in texts being studied and rituals being performed, in questions being asked by new generations, in the eternal return of seasons and festivals, in the ongoing dialogue between the human and the divine. The mist rises from the river, the shapes within it becoming indistinct, fading back into formlessness, but not disappearing, never disappearing, only withdrawing, waiting, ready to manifest again when called upon, when needed, when devotion creates the space for presence. The journey completes, the circle closes, the telling rests, and in the stillness that follows, perhaps something remains, some residue of wonder, some echo of the infinite, some recognition that these gods, in all their multiplicity and contradiction, point toward a reality that exceeds all naming, all knowing, all telling. And the final words drift away like smoke, like morning mist, like prayers carried on the wind, toward mountains where gods have meditated since before time began, dissolving into silence, into peace, into the vast and gentle darkness where all stories begin, and to which all stories, in the end, return.